Alright guys, so we're back with another video and we're going to talk about data encapsulation. So encapsulation is just the practice of grouping together related fields and methods into one single unit. And sometimes we can actually restrict access to some of these fields from outside classes. Okay, so we've done this before. We've implemented an animal class, we gave it fields and methods, and then we create an instance of that animal class, and then we were able to invoke its methods. Okay, now sometimes there might be certain properties and certain methods that should only be available to the class itself, and other classes from the outside should not be able to access it directly. This is the whole concept of data encapsulation and data hiding. The main goal is to just hide internal details that should be kept private, and it shouldn't be accessed by anyone. So let's just say, for example, if I had all of these variables declared, now we can see that we have a username, an email, a type, and create an on variable, and they all have their values. But again, like I said, we can practice data encapsulation by taking all these variables, and instead of having them just out there, we can group them into a single entity, into a single class, a single object. And we can say, hey, look, this could easily be a user class that we could implement. Now, in a language like Java, we use something called access specifiers to hide certain parts of our code that we don't want accessed by the outside. Now, JavaScript does not have access specifiers. We're actually going to use a language called TypeScript, which is pretty much just JavaScript that has a bunch of other amazing features. Okay, and if you want to practice object-oriented programming, but you don't want to completely switch from JavaScript to, like, let's say Java, then I would highly suggest you start learning TypeScript. And I have a video that explains how to get started with TypeScript, how to set everything up. So I highly recommend you guys check that out. Let's actually go ahead and jump into Visual Studio Code. And we're going to go ahead and use TypeScript to implement a simple class and practice data encapsulation. All right, so we're going to create a user.ts file. And I'm going to go ahead and just create a class called user. It's the same way you do it in JavaScript. Now this time, we're going to create instance fields for our user class. Okay, remember, instance fields are just fields that belong to the class itself, the instance. So we're going to use the private keyword, which basically is going to mean that this instance field is private to the user class. Only the user class is able to access it. So we're going to go ahead and do private username. And I'm going to have this be a string data type. Okay, you can use :string to infer the type of username, which is a TypeScript feature, not a JavaScript feature. We're going to give our user an email field, and we're also going to give it a verified field, and this is going to be a boolean. And now we're going to implement the constructor, and this is just going to take in those same parameters. So username is a string, email is a string, and then verified is a boolean. And now we're going to take these values that we're passing into the constructor, and we're going to assign it to the private field. So notice how I'm actually able to reference the field inside the user class. Okay, you'll see the difference once we actually create an instance of the user class and then try to reference username. So we're just going to assign username to this.username, assign email to this.email, and then the same thing for verified. Now watch this. If I try to create an instance of our user, we shouldn't have any problem, right? So I'm going to go ahead and just create our user instance, and we'll just say we're verified. And now if I try to reference user.username, we're going to get this error over here. It's saying property username is private and only accessible within class user. Now this is a TypeScript thing. Okay, if we were to actually transpile this down to JavaScript, there wouldn't really be an issue. It would still work just fine. But if we try to compile this code using the tsc command, so to compile you do tsc and then the name of the file, it's going to give us an error in the console. It's saying property username is private and only accessible within class user. It's still going to compile, okay? And this is what it looks like once it's compiled down to JavaScript. But if we actually try to run this using tsnode, and let me run the user.ts file, we're getting an error, right? Because we're trying to reference a field that's private. So what do? So the common practice when it comes to data encapsulation and object-oriented programming is to create all of your fields private and then create public methods that allow you to access those private fields. And now these methods are actually known as getters and setters. You've probably heard of them before in another language, or you've heard about them in JavaScript ES6, okay? But in common practice, you create a public method and this is going to be a getter, and the getter is used to get the private field. So we want to get the username, so we're going to do public get username, and I'm going to go ahead and just say this returns a string. Okay, and we're just going to return this style username, and notice how I'm actually able to reference the username field inside the class, but I can't access it outside of the class, right? After line 16, we are outside of the user class. Now, if I want to go ahead and log the username to the console, if I reference user dot, you can see we have one public field, one public member, and that's a method, the get username method. And again, this is called a getter or an accessor, and the main point is to get the data, to access the private data. Okay, so let's go ahead and use TS node and compile, or not compile, run our TS file. And you can see it logs sty on line 13, and then it logs it on line 19. Okay, so on line 19, we're referencing our public getter. Okay, remember, it's public, so we can reference it from outside the class, and we can use that to get the private field. Okay, and if you wanted to compile your code down, you would do tsc user.ts, and then you would run node user.js. Okay, see how we have a user.js file over here? Cool. And likewise, if I wanted to update the value of username, we would create something called a setter. So set username. And by convention, you name your getters with a lowercase get, okay, get, and then the name of the field. This is called Camel Case, where the first letter of the first word is lowercase, and then every other word after the first letter is always capitalized. Okay, it's a common convention. So we're going to go ahead and pass in a username now. And this setter is also known as a mutator. It mutates, it changes the data. Okay, and we're going to just set it to username. So now I'm going to call user.setUsername, and notice how we're able to reference it because it's a public method. And we're going to pass in Anson. So if I log user.getUsername to the console, the return value of username, let's go ahead and use TS node. You can see we have updated the value of our object. We updated the field username to Anson. Okay, and we can do the same thing for email and verify too. And like I said, this is common practice when you have when you're following data encapsulation. Okay, you want to keep all of your fields private and have public accessors and mutators to get the data and update the data. And I think you guys get the point. There's no need for me to continue on with the rest of the implementation. But yeah, it's a very simple concept that a lot of people never really learn. And once you learn this, following this pattern is actually pretty useful. And I highly suggest you guys to read more about data encapsulation and study it, because it's a very important concept in object-oriented programming. Obviously, we can't cover every single thing, and obviously there really isn't so much to this whole topic. It's just, following certain practices and seeing how it works in practice. But I really hope this made sense to you guys, and I will see you guys in my next video. Peace.